Hi, my name's Tim Darcy Ellis and I'm the author of The Secret Diaries of Juan Luis Vives, which is my debut novel concerning the life and epoch-making adventures of the great Spanish humanist and Renaissance scholar Juan Luis Vives, who was born in Valencia in 1492. And the novel is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones and various online and selected retailers. And I was fortunate enough to hit the #1 spot on the Amazon bestsellers list for Spanish literature and religious historical fiction. So I wanted to talk today about some of those things that drew me to Vives and what motivated me to write the book. I was formerly an archaeologist. I worked at the Museum of London and I was a tour guide at the British Museum, and I studied medieval archaeology at the University of York. And so I was always fascinated in this period of history, that sort of moving through from the medieval into the modern period. But it took me some time before I found out about Juan Luis Vives, because he doesn't turn up in the English narrative. You have to look a bit further afield. And so, you know, much later in life, I was actually giving a friend a book about exiles from Spain in relation to what happened more recently in 20th century history. But I flicked through and I found this amazing story about this amazing man. So as I say, he was born 1492. And he was born to a family of conversos. So these were people who had practiced Judaism for generations. But in the year of his birth, the decree of Alhambra was passed, which the King Ferdinand and the Queen Isabella forbade Jews to live in their realm. So they were given two choices: either they could leave or they could stay and convert. And Vives' family, which may be a decision that they later came to regret, decided to stay and make the outward appearance of converting to Catholicism. Others left and they went mainly into the Ottoman realm, where they were welcomed with open arms. So when I discovered Vives, I started looking at some of his philosophies, and I found that he was really a man ahead of his time. And we think, you know, in 2020 today, he was mainly writing in the 1520s. And a lot of those things that he wrote about have become really entrenched in the way that we live our lives today, and some of those major institutions of the modern world. He basically said that the education of women was just as important as the education of men. He advocated for a League of Nations that would bind all those countries in Europe and North Africa and what then became the Middle East together with certain rules and ethical codes that would prevent war. He was very much against war. He was a real pacifist ahead of his time. You know, he was against persecution, and he advocated for the care of the sick, and he spoke a lot about the care of the mentally ill, to such an extent that he's later been called the godfather of psychoanalysis and the father of psychology. And he wrote a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, about mood and affect, about linguistics and the choice of words that people used, and how that reflected what was going on with the psyche. So this was, you know, a while ago that he was writing about these areas that now become part of the way that we live our life. And he also said that poor people, poor children, their children need to be taught skills so that they can stop being poor in future generations and break that cycle of poverty. So when I found out about Vives, I started to get interested before I knew anything really about the nitty-gritty of his life. And I knew the basics of his family background, but when I looked into it, I just found out how fascinating his story was, and it was full of intrigue and drama and fear and suspicion, you know, on the run from the Inquisition, always looking over his shoulder to see if they were coming up behind him. But he had this great passion to say the things that he always needed to say, those messages that I was just talking about. So he was born, as I say, 1492. Went to school. His family were very well educated, and they were a wealthy family. His father had come from generations of the wool trade, and he went to school and it was the kind of background where the children argued and they spoke and they had great debates. And he says, you know, they wrangled at breakfast, they wrangled at lunchtime, they wrangled in the chapel, they wrangled in the playing fields, they wrangled in the sweating room. At all times they wrangled, you know, and it was very much this sort of discursive, dialectic kind of argumentative background that gave him his great skills of oratory, that as he moved through Europe and eventually came to England, Cardinal Wolsey called him Dr. Mellifluo, which means Dr. Mellifluous, because his prose flowed like honey. And it was from that background of education in that school where that came from. And he was very heavily influenced by the Italian humanists, and some of whom sort of were harking back to a kind of first century Christianity, where it was very much in the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition. And really trying to sort of move away from some of the trappings of the church, of the wealth of the church by the time that he was born. So, born into very difficult circumstances. His mother, we know, made an outward appearance of converting to Christianity in 1491. But how sincere that conversion was, we don't really know. Some people say that he was completely Christian, but my feeling is that he was very much influenced by his Jewish family, who very much came under the thumb of persecution. And the track that I've taken with my novel, and I know it's controversial to some historians, that he was more influenced by his Jewish heritage than you would guess from reading his work. And he had to cover all traces of that in his work for fear of what happened to his family, which I was just going to read a little bit about, would happen to him. Now, this is my novel here, but the person that I've really followed in studying Vives is a great scholar called Carlos Noreña. And he, writes a little bit here about the kind of difficulty that the Vives family experienced and the background of the Jews in Europe around that period of time. So this is Noreña. For 900 years, most Jews throughout Western Europe had enjoyed warm hospitality and often moved into positions of power, their very success eventually causing them to become objects of envy and then hatred. They underwent expulsion from England in the late 13th century, from France in the 14th, from much of Germany in the next century, and from Spain, Portugal, and Italy in the 16th. These nations were seeking scapegoats, as it happened, for the many economic tribulations inherent in the shaky currencies and top-heavy political institutions of the time. In Spain, however, there was born a special fear that a large Jewish population, much of it called conversos, but also cursed as marranos, pigs, by the loyal Orthodox, were divisive, dangerous, in spite of their having lived in a comparative peace heretofore with their native-born Christian neighbours. In this now uneasy religious atmosphere came Vives, so alone, a Jew in a nation of Spanish Christians, a Marrano by birth in the smaller society of Jews, a subsequent exile from a life with his family and its foredoomed head. So just to sort of go on to talk a bit more about what happened to his family, Noreña goes on, in Vives's case it seems unavoidable to ask how far his Jewish ancestry helped to shape his emotional makeup, and whether his thoughts on the emotions betray in any way the tensions and conflicts he must have experienced as a Spanish Jew. Such investigation requires, however, a closer look at Vives's individual case. Vives's father was the ideal target of inquisitorial suspicion and social alienation. He was a successful merchant in a rich agricultural region, a member of a ruling elite that included many other Jews in their professions and in key state positions. When Vives was 7 years old enough to remember, his father was arrested by the Inquisition. For a long time, his father remained clear of any charges, but other family members were not equally lucky and were sentenced to death. Probably in January 1524, after a 2-year trial, Vives's father was also executed by order of the Inquisition. At that time, Vives was 32 years of age, married and teaching at Oxford. His sadness and bitterness were augmented by concern for his sisters, Beatriz, Eva and Leonora, who feature in my novel, a concern that was proved more than justified when 3 years later the Inquisition opened another trial against Vives's mother, who had been dead since 1508, and found her guilty of having visited the synagogue after her alleged conversion. As a result, her remains were exhumed and desecrated, and Vives's sisters were deprived of any right to their parental inheritance. We know from his private correspondence that news of his father's tragic death and his own concern over his sisters broke his health and seriously affected his entire outlook on life. He wrote that sadness causes such a dejection and obfuscation of the spirit that one could become lifeless and misanthropic. His correspondence from 1522 through 1531 presents the heartbreaking picture of a man overwhelmed by the terribly sad news from Spain. So I just wanted to sort of read that from the book there. And what a difficult background he came from, but that didn't stop him speaking. It didn't stop him voicing all those philosophies and beliefs and thoughts that we were speaking about earlier. And he wasn't frightened to tackle the key players of his time. He really let them have it, which is one of the things I love about Vives. He basically wrote to the Pope in 1522 and said, two things are required of you. One is stillness amongst the princes against arms, and stillness amongst the people against sedition. He was a peacemaker, and he didn't like sedition, and he didn't like gossip, because he knew where that could lead. You know, that could lead to great tragedy, and it had for him and his family. In terms of Henry VIII, who he became very well acquainted with during his sojourns to England, he told Henry to be aware of his arrogance. The King of France was imprisoned at one time, and he said, look, Henry, this could happen to you. So be very careful. And he told Henry that no war is preferable to peace. So his great contemporaries during these years were Erasmus the Great of Rotterdam, who said that in time Vives will become more famous than all of us. And to Thomas More of England, who said that, you know, Vives, no one surpasses Vives in terms of the quality and measure of his studies. So all these things, you know, really got me interested in his story. He left Spain in 1509 at the age of 16. He never went back. And as these terrible tragedies unfolded in relation to his family, it was just too dangerous for him to go back, and he decided to stay. He moved to Paris, educated at the Sorbonne, and interestingly there he was in Paris at the same time as Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn, who were ladies-in-waiting to Queen Claude. And I've written some of that kind of interaction into the novel. From there, he moved on to what became the Spanish Netherlands, to Louvain and to Bruges, where he educated the sons of the nobility and wrote some of his great works. He was invited to the English court to teach the daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon, Princess Mary Tudor. And to lecture at the University of Oxford. So he went to England in 1521, 1522, and he was known as Dr. John Lewis of Oxford. I think the English couldn't get their head around Juan Luis as a name. So he became very well respected. He was great friends with those people that I spoke about. One of the English great physicians and philosophers, Thomas Linacre, became a great friend and father figure of him, who'd been physician to Henry VII and was physician to Henry VIII. Became very close to Princess Mary, and he had a very strong curriculum for her education, and to her mother, Queen Catherine of Aragon. And you know, he records that, you know, on a barge upstream to Windsor, he had a conversation with Catherine the Queen, who was under, you know, a terribly difficult situation. The king was trying to divorce her. He wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Vives became the confidant of the Queen, and he asked her, Madam, if you had to choose between triumph and disaster, what would you choose? She said, well, I would choose an equal measure of both, because if I just had triumph, how would I ever learn anything? And he said, yes, but madam, if you had to choose one of those two, what would you choose? And she said, I would choose disaster, because that way I would learn, and learning is so important to the spirit and to the soul. He became very close to Catherine, and that, again, is written into my novel, and some of the intrigues and the suspicions of that relationship. He fell foul of Cardinal Wolsey, who banned him from teaching from Oxford for subversiveness, and breached his confidentiality with Catherine. And so Vives and Wolsey fell out. The king and Vives fell out. I don't want to give too many spoilers away about what happened next, but imprisonment was one of the outcomes. So all that is written into my novel here. You know, but really today I just wanted to talk about, and full of court drama, royal intrigue, you know, forbidden love, dark love, him trying to keep his secrets. It's called The Secret Diaries of Juan Luis Vives for, you know, for a very good reason. But I wanted to put, you know, in writing the novel, I wanted to put a voice. You know, we have great tracts of his writings, which is fantastic, you know, and he has these wonderful philosophies, but we don't have much of his voice. And it is a work of fiction. And so I really wanted to bring him to the light, especially in the English tradition. You know, he is well known on the continent, in Europe, and there are institutions named after him. But in the Anglo tradition, we don't read much about him. So I think that's about it. I just wanted to finish with a couple of quotes. And I'm going to read something from the book which just sums Vives up to me, and his love of peace and concord and his vision for a better world. He was committed to this concept in Hebrew called tikkun olam, which means repair of the world. And in one of his quotes I feature in the very back of the novel, it ought to be the duty of the public officials to take pains to see that men help one another, that no one is oppressed, no one wronged by an unjust condemnation, and that the strong come to the assistance of the weak in order that the harmony of the united body of citizens may grow in love day by day and endure forever. Juan Luis Vives, 1525. Okay, so thank you very much, and I look forward to doing some more of these talks about Juan Luis Vives really soon. Thank you.